To determine when a plant is ready, or the indicators of harvest time. So I'm looking for both the pistils and the trichomes will begin to change color as the plant matures and gets closer to harvest. And the plant itself will start to lose energy. You'll notice change of color in some of the leaves. A lot of the big fan leaves will start to wither, turn yellow, as the plant kind of withdraws the nutrients out of those and basically sheds them in a way. And then the plant itself will just start to lose energy, start to lose momentum. When you first go into flower, you see it build real quickly into that push, and then as it gets towards the end, that energy backs way off. The pistils and trichomes will shift from, the trichomes are generally a clear early, then turn milky, and then will start to oxidize, turn orange, dark and tan on the outside. When you start to see a ratio of about 80-20 with the pistils, which do the same thing, go from a white color, or I shouldn't necessarily say that, they're not all white, but they'll go from alive, healthy, moisture present, to dry, withered, and often a darker color. The moist is the new growth. And you'll start to see the plant slow down. The new pistils emerging will slow down and slow down and slow down. The old ones will wither. And eventually what ends up happening is you end up with different ratios. Early into flower, you should, if the plant is healthy, you'll have close to 100% of the pistils are a lighter color and alive and actively emerging. And then as that slows down and the old ones start to turn dark, the new ones will slow as well. The new emergence will slow down. And eventually what you end up with is the majority of them are dead or dry and withered. And so the two changing color and kind of the ratios, the percentages that you find are what lead you into the question of, is it time to harvest? So when it comes time to harvest, often the manner of the harvest depends on the plant. It's done differently indoors, the greenhouses and outdoor scenarios, depending on how big that plant was. Usually for me is the determining factor, what method you might consider. You can go in and take the whole plant down and just hang the entire plant. With some of the bigger ones, what you'll see is that the flowers mature on the outside before they mature on the inside. So the things down on the inside branches below the colas will be sometimes a week behind, week and a half. And if you take the tops off of big plants first and then allow that inside to mature a little bit, in my experience, you end up with a higher yield. You can do 2 is obviously the starting point if you're going more than 1. I've seen it done as many as 4 and 5 times. I think when you start to get into 5 cuts on the same plant, that's not necessarily viable commercially. But I think a first harvest on the outside of some of the big plants is, and increases your yield and can increase the quality of the material down on the inside. If you allow that access to sunlight before taking it, so you take the tops off and de-leaf a little bit the outside of the plant again, and allow that light to get in and penetrate down into some of that stuff that hasn't really seen light, you'll notice that they get more dense. A lot of times they'll put on mass, they'll continue to grow, and a lot of times what you'll find is that when the outside colas specifically are ready for harvest, if you look down inside, that stuff still has a ways to go. All of the pistils will be, the pistils will tend to be fresher, younger, continuing to emerge or appearing to continue to emerge. Very few dry, withered compared to the outsides. And the trichomes as well will generally be behind the outside, behind the colas, the outside of the plant. Generally, the key, I think, for the curing of it is controlling the temperature and humidity in the room and trying to keep that as stable as possible. fluctuations in temperature and humidity are what begin to turn the plant colors. In a lot of cases, you'll start to see things will tan off if they were taken on a little bit too hard of a ride. What you want to try and do is bring the temperature and humidity of the plant material kind of down, and kind of slide it in rather than just all the humidity out and then continue to drain off what continues to come out of the plant material for a few days. The drying of the material will take a little bit too hard of a dip, and a lot of times what you'll do is you'll dip below the threshold for the cure, which is, if I remember correctly, is 50%. And so if you drop that plant material below 50% humidity, that curing process stops, and what you have is a dried material. Often the difference between that drying it versus kind of curing it versus slowly withdrawing the last bits of moisture out, the difference is often found in the smoke. The young stuff, the flash dried, as I tend to refer to it, the flash dried stuff, you tend to get a little bit harsher smoke. And the THC too kind of changes the experience as it matures. It softens, it mellows the experience a little bit, especially with some of the sativa stuff that can get you really racy, very uplifting, but a lot of times that can be a little bit too much with some of the strains that we have now being so incredibly high in THC. It'll soften that, I guess, similar to the way that they age tobacco or wine. With wines, you know, that there's a sharper flavor. In my experience, it's kind of a sharper tint to the young stuff, and then as you get older, it gets kind of smoother, more refined, and that same type of thing happens with THC, which with cannabis. For the cure, the temperature and humidity, controlling the temperature and humidity of the room is kind of the biggest priority for me, is watching that temperature and humidity in the room, not necessarily in the plant material, but in the room. So as you first load up a cure space or a dry space, and that fresh plant material will be shedding moisture very, very quickly. So your humidity will shoot up and it will stay high for usually 2, 3, 4 days. During that stage, I take the humidity out as fast as possible. And then as that starts to slow down, I will back off the speed at which I'm pulling the humidity out of the room. And that kind of allows the plant material to shed the moisture and a little bit more drawing out that drying process, or the process of shedding the moisture. And what I'm trying to avoid is just kind of a crash in humidity, sucking it out too fast. And a lot of times what you'll end up doing is you'll dry it too fast, it'll become crispy, you'll drop below the threshold of 50%, and once you drop below that threshold, my understanding of the process is that that's when the curing stops, and once it stops, there's no restarting it. So in order, the difference between drying it and curing it is maintaining a minimum of 50% humidity in the material, and drawing it out slowly, elongating that process a bit. Drawing out that process ends up with a higher quality product. Cure space temperature, I tend to keep it as low as most AC systems will allow, which seems to be in the mid to high 50s. And then as I'm drawing out the humidity, the only other real concern that I have is airflow in the room, keeping the humidity within that room consistent throughout the room, not having higher humidity down low, hot, dry air up top. You'll end up with an uneven cure. If I'm able to hold the room for a few days at 55% humidity, that's kind of I've had my best results that way. If I'm able to draw that process out and finish by being able to hold the temperature and humidity in the room, temperature low and consistent from start to finish, or as close to consistent as I can get from start to finish, and then the humidity, drawing that out quickly at the beginning, slowing it way down, and then that last few days of the process, I should be able to, if I'm on top of things and in a easily controlled environment, I should be able to take that last few days and just hold the room right where it is and allow the last little bit of humidity to kind of make its way from the inside of the flower to the outside, out into the air. And then if you're able to get that whole space to hold that 55% humidity for that extra day or 2 days, what you're doing is kind of evening everything out. So if there are parts that dried a little bit faster than others, that last little bit of humidity is going to continue to work itself out of the dense, the more dense material, and you'll end up with a more consistent humidity throughout. So the outside of the flower will be roughly 55%, 60% humidity, and the inside will be the same, versus the outside being 40% humidity or 35% humidity or even 50% humidity, and the inside is still in the 60s or 70s, 10 to 20 points higher on the inside. For that first stage of the cure can be broken into stages. You don't necessarily have to keep the entire process in your drying space or in your initial kind of initial cure space. If you can draw that process, the first step of the process, out to 10, 12 days, that seems to be a very easily achievable target. Where if you draw it out too long, then you're just allowing that stuff to kind of sit out in the air a little bit longer than needed. You then break it down into bins, and you can kind of slow walk the remainder of the process there by just checking the bins on occasion, closing them up and allowing that humidity in the bin to even out, keeping track obviously of what that is, and if there's still a little bit more humidity to escape, you can burp the lids on occasion. There are a handful of ways to go into that second stage of cure. What's been, I think, very popular for a very long time now on what's been more of the hobbyist scale compared to, we're now expanding into full-scale commercial production type facilities, but in the history of Canada, the last 60 years of the history of cannabis at least, it's been underground and on a small scale, which makes it to where large mason jars or 5-gallon buckets, sealable containers of that size, work well for the second stage of cure. I tend to go towards food grade material. You don't necessarily just want to go grab a Home Depot bucket. I think that the smells, the off-gassing of the manufacturing process of the plastics can work its way into the flower material. But any sort of food grade plastic or glass in anything mason jar up to maybe a 5-gallon, as you scale that up, you start to look at things like 55-gallon drums that can be just rotated on a rack a little bit at a time to kind of keep that material moving. If there is any humidity left, you don't want it all sinking to the bottom. You want everything in there to kind of cure evenly, so you can turn that 55-gallon bucket, 55-gallon drum on a rack, similar to what you see with whiskey, the barrels.
So you're putting it on its side?
Yeah, on its side. It seems like the key to longer term storage is in temperature and humidity levels being maintained, but also removing the oxygen from the equation. So storing in vacuum sealed or nitrogen sealed bags, similar to the way they store a lot of things in the market, in the supermarket. More often than not, what I see is a rush to get paid that causes people to skip that last step. And so assuming you've gotten all the way to the finish line and you have clean, healthy material, the most common way people kind of lose that quality level that I found is in the drying process and then storage, transportation. Any sort of heat and humidity fluctuations will cause that material to start to turn the color first, and smell. Let's just say both will go usually hand in hand. Depending on how that material is treated, if it's not treated well after harvest, you lose value. So if you had something that may sell for $1,000 a pound, now the smell is kind of diminished and the appearance is starting to turn a little bit. There's a little bit more color. It's not a clean green dried material or cured material. It starts to tan, turn various shades of yellow, orange. Tint will start to come into the material, and then the smell will also start to diminish or turn into something else. A lot of times you'll be able to really tell from the smell specifically what's happening. Was the material cured properly, stored properly, or was it put away wet? Will create a little bit a different scent than if it was beaten up while it was still alive and then properly cured. Things like that. So you'll start to see the quality level diminish, and in a lot of cases it seems that is due to kind of a rush to get to market, rush to get paid, and in that rush you end up taking less on the material.